Imagine a city where there were no limits, where desire ruled, where no one cared about tomorrow. Sodom and Gomorrah were not just cities, they were a symbol of decadence, where luxury, perversion, and sexual immorality walked hand in hand. Bustling streets, markets filled with gold and spices, luxurious palaces, but behind this glitter, there was a dark world. No one was safe. Violence dominated the streets, justice was bought with gold, and morality ridiculed. The parties never ended. The city took pride in defying any moral rule, promoting profane rituals, limitless depravity, and a lifestyle where carnal pleasure was idolized. Betrayal was encouraged, infidelity was celebrated, and anyone who opposed it paid a high price. But everything changed in a single day. When the inhabitants thought they were untouchable, the sky opened, and destruction came like a storm of fire and sulfur. Soon, Sodom disappeared from history in a matter of hours. But what really happened in these cities? What were the sins that led to their destruction? And the most terrifying question, what does this story reveal about the future of humanity? Stay with me until the end, because there is a detail in this story that almost no one notices. And if you believe that today's world is heading toward the same fate, leave your opinion in the comments. Together, we can grow in our spiritual journey. Wealth and luxury. Sodom was not just an ordinary city. It was an empire of wealth, a commercial hub where everything was for sale. Anyone who crossed its gates saw a bustling place, full of shops and markets overflowing with valuable goods. Trade never stopped. Caravans arrived from distant lands, bringing silks from the east, perfumes from Egypt, precious stones from Mesopotamia, and olive oil from the Mediterranean shores. It was a city where gold spoke louder than morality. The main streets were always chaotic. Merchants shouted their offers, trying to attract distracted buyers. Stalls displayed gold and silver, while spice vendors released exotic aromas into the air to lure customers. The smell of roasted meat and freshly baked bread mixed with expensive perfumes, creating an intense and luxurious atmosphere. But not everything was as it seemed. The most cunning merchants manipulated weights and measures to deceive customers, enriching themselves at the expense of others' naivety. Here, profit was more important than honesty. At the heart of the city were the homes of the wealthiest. They were true fortresses of luxury made of carved stone, with tall columns, imposing balconies, and inner gardens filled with fountains and statues. Inside them, the owners flaunted their fortunes with extravagant feasts, where wine flowed uncontrollably and food was served in absurd quantities. Dinners that could feed dozens of poor families for months were devoured in a single night of excess. For Sodom's elite, life was an endless banquet. Fine clothing, gleaming jewelry, and expensive perfumes were status symbols. The most powerful competed to see who could host the most luxurious party, where dancers, musicians, and servants were used as mere objects of entertainment. Waste was a sign of power. Burning food and spilling wine on the floor to prove they had more than they needed was a common habit. But this wealth had a price. Inequality was brutal. While the nobles lived in excess, the poor were forgotten, treated as a nuisance, a dead weight on the city. Those without money were not just ignored but despised. If someone fell into misery, there was no hope of starting over. Sodom did not value kindness. Helping someone was seen as a sign of weakness. Charity did not exist. If a man lost everything, he would not find a helping hand. If a widow or orphan needed assistance, they would be kicked out of the squares. Anyone who went into debt could be sold as a slave. That was how the city worked. Those at the top trampled on those below. The law was a privilege of the powerful. Corrupt judges favored the rich and despised the poor. If a man without money was wrongly accused, there was no possible defense. But if a wealthy merchant stole or cheated, he only needed to offer a bribe and the crime disappeared. Justice was a game for those with gold. But what happened in the poorer neighborhoods was even worse. Far from the central squares and large markets, Sodom revealed its true face. The alleys were dark, narrow, and filthy. Poorly built houses of mud and wood were stacked on top of each other, with no structure whatsoever. Dust filled the air, and the smell of filth lingered in the streets, as there was no sanitation or clean water. Children ran barefoot on the dirt floors, many of them starving, sick, and without hope for a better future. Their clothes were dirty rags, their bodies fragile and thin. Many never reached adulthood, dying from hunger or diseases that could have been prevented with minimal care. Desperate mothers tried to gather scraps of food in the markets but were driven away like animals. If they dared to ask for help, the merchants laughed at their suffering. The poor were not just ignored, they were hated. The city believed that the weak did not deserve to live. Arrogance and selfishness took over Sodom. The rich saw themselves as untouchable. The powerful thought they would never have to answer to anyone. They believed their wealth was eternal, that their fortunes guaranteed their safety. But they were wrong. No city built on injustice and oppression can last forever. The pride of the powerful was about to be destroyed, and in the next chapter you will see how Sodom surrendered to a lawless lifestyle and why that sealed its fate forever. Pleasure and depravity. In Sodom, there were no limits. No rules, no restrictions, no shame. Desire was the only law. Right and wrong no longer existed. If something brought pleasure, it was allowed. As soon as the sun set, the city turned into a stage of perversion. The sound of drums echoed through the streets, mixed with screams and uncontrolled laughter. The squares and markets, which during the day were centers of commerce, became spaces of orgies and debauchery. There, without shame or restriction, men and women indulged in the most degrading acts before everyone. The parties began at nightfall and had no set end. Wine flowed endlessly until the participants were completely intoxicated. The drunker they got, the more they gave in to their darkest instincts. Depravity became collective, without distinction of age or social status. Slaves and servants were forced to take part in these practices, used as objects by the wealthiest and most powerful. The city's most influential people took pride in attracting foreigners to Sodom. Merchants, travelers, and outsiders were seduced by the promise of wealth and limitless pleasure. Many came without knowing what awaited them. Some willingly embraced the city's culture, but others were forced to participate in its rituals. In the streets, debauchery happened openly. Sexual acts were performed in front of anyone, without age or status restrictions. What should have been done in secrecy was now part of everyday life. Sodom prided itself on defying any notion of morality, turning uncontrolled desire into its greatest virtue. Marriages meant nothing. Marital fidelity was seen as a weakness. Women betrayed their husbands without fear, and men shared their wives as if they were common property. Beyond this, men were with men and women with women. Love and commitment were replaced by a culture of insatiable desire, where no one belonged to anyone. Immorality was not just in personal relationships, but also in the city's social structure itself. Children grew up without guidance, without examples of dignity, learning from an early age that life revolved around immediate pleasure. Young people were encouraged to participate in the city's practices and were initiated into debauchery from childhood. But the height of perversion took place inside the pagan temples. What should have been a place of worship had turned into a center for profane rituals, where the worship of the gods was just an excuse to satisfy the most depraved pleasures. The priests promoted ceremonies where lewd acts were performed in public before idols and sacred images. It was believed that these practices would bring fertility, wealth, and power, but in reality, they were merely a reflection of Sodom's decadence. Young people were taken by force to these temples, where they were initiated into the culture of depravity. They had no choice. From an early age, they were taught that purity was an outdated concept and that the body was merely an instrument for pleasure. Many were abused and exploited by the very priests who presented themselves as intermediaries of the gods, but were nothing more than corrupt men drowning in sin. The city took pride in this. They not only accepted this immoral lifestyle, but celebrated it. Being pure was a reason for ridicule. Anyone who refused to participate in these practices was mocked and cast out. Those who still tried to live morally were persecuted and often attacked. Sodom believed its culture of libertinism was a symbol of progress. They considered themselves an advanced society, superior to others, free from the chains of morality. But in reality, they were slaves to their own desires. The more they sought pleasure, the deeper they sank into darkness. What was once new became dull. Desire led to obsession, and obsession opened the door to increasingly degrading practices. The concept of family disappeared completely. Children did not know their parents, husbands and wives were traded like commodities, and blood ties meant nothing. Chaos began to consume the city. Unlimited desire led to violence, violence led to despair, and despair turned Sodom into a place where no one trusted anyone. The people of Sodom did not realize they were destroying themselves from within. They believed they were free, but they were trapped in an endless cycle of depravity. The pleasure that once seemed like a gift became a burden. The city was corrupt at its core. Lust ruled, and morality had completely disappeared. Violence and perversion. As Sodom plunged into limitless lust, another characteristic of the city became increasingly evident: the brutality of its inhabitants. Respect for life simply did not exist. Crime went unpunished, cruelty was normal, and justice was a privilege bought with gold. Those with money could do whatever they wanted, while the poor were ignored, crushed by the system. When night fell, the streets became a hunting ground. Anyone walking alone risked being attacked, beaten, or killed without anyone intervening. If someone cried out for help, the doors of the houses would shut. The entire city pretended not to see. The suffering of others did not evoke compassion. It provided entertainment. Robberies happened in broad daylight. If anyone tried to resist, they were lynched. Murders occurred openly, and the victims' bodies were left to rot on the ground. But the most vulnerable targets were foreigners. In many ancient cultures, welcoming visitors was a sacred duty. But in Sodom, outsiders were treated as playthings for the inhabitants' perversion. Anyone who arrived alone was in danger. Many were ambushed, humiliated, and assaulted just for fun. If they were young, women, or appeared defenseless, their fate was even worse. The city's own leaders encouraged this cruelty. Judges and rulers did not protect the weak. On the contrary, they were the first to abuse their power. If a rich man desired something, money, property, or even people, he simply took it. If a poor man sought justice, he was ridiculed. The courts existed only to maintain the illusion of order, but truth was irrelevant. The verdict always favored the strongest. Those with power ruled, those without suffered in silence. And women were the greatest victims of this rotten system. In Sodom, a woman was not seen as a human being with inherent value. Her fate was determined by her husband, her father, or any man with more power than she had. Her will did not matter, only her usefulness. If she was young and beautiful, she served as a bargaining chip. Marriages were nothing more than business transactions. Women were promised from childhood to wealthy men, and no one cared about their desires. Their bodies were merely valuable assets to be traded. If she was widowed, elderly, or had no possessions, she was abandoned without mercy. Many starved to death in the streets, ignored as if they did not exist. No man wanted the burden of supporting them. To Sodom, those who did not generate profit did not deserve to live. And for children, the reality was even worse. In Sodom, childhood did not exist. The children of the rich grew up learning that compassion was a weakness and that power justified anything. From an early age, they were taught to dominate, exploit, and despise those beneath them. Meanwhile, the children of the poor never had any chance at all. Many were sold as slaves. Others were simply left to die if they were deemed useless. The concept of family did not exist. Blood ties meant nothing. And the most horrifying of all, human sacrifices. Inside Sodom's temples, dark rituals took place far from the public eye. Small children were brought to stone altars and offered as living sacrifices to the city's gods. The priests taught that these sacrifices would ensure abundance, prosperity, and protection. But the truth was that these acts only further deepened the city's corruption and decay. Sodom's brutality was no accident, it was a choice. They chose evil, they chose perversion, and now their fate awaited them. Love had disappeared. Justice was forgotten. Compassion had become a source of shame. The city did not just accept evil, it worshipped it. But judgment was on its way, and the fall of Sodom was closer than its inhabitants could have imagined. The last day. The day began like any other in Sodom. The markets were full, the nobles planned their feasts, and the temples prepared for more immoral rituals. The city pulsed as always, indulging in its routine of excess and corruption. Luxury and pleasure seemed endless, and no one imagined that this would be Sodom's last day. The night before, two strangers had arrived in the city. They were not merchants or ordinary travelers. They were angels sent with a single mission: to destroy Sodom. Silent and imposing, they were received at the house of Lot, a righteous man who still tried to maintain his faith amidst the moral chaos around him. But as soon as word of their arrival spread, a crowd began to gather outside the house. The men of the city demanded that the visitors be handed over so they could abuse them. This was the level of depravity that ruled Sodom. The lowest desires found no barriers. There were no longer any limits, no conscience. What was once hidden in the shadows was now celebrated in public. But that night, Sodom would meet judgment. With a simple gesture, the angels struck the men surrounding the house with blindness, leaving them in total despair. They screamed, stumbled, trying to understand what had happened. Panic consumed them, but the city's fate was already sealed. Turning to Lot, the angels were direct. "Take your family and leave immediately. This place will be destroyed." The warning was clear. Sodom was condemned. At dawn, Lot tried to convince his sons-in-law to flee, but they laughed at him. To them, the idea that Sodom would be destroyed seemed absurd. How could a city so rich, so powerful, full of life simply disappear? Gold and silver gleamed in the markets. The feasts continued as always. The sun would rise just like any other day, but they were wrong. Judgment was at the door. As the first rays of sunlight began to illuminate the horizon, something changed. The wind became heavy and hot. The air carried something strange. The birds fell silent. The world seemed to hold its breath. Lot, his wife, and his daughters fled quickly. They received one final warning: do not look back. They had to keep moving forward without hesitation, but behind them, Sodom was being destroyed. The sky, once blue and calm, was overtaken by a thick, black cloud. A deep roar came from above, and then the first bolt of fire fell. The impact was devastating. In seconds, the entire city was engulfed in flames raining from the sky like an infernal storm. The heat was unbearable, consuming everything it touched. the air filled with smoke, ash, and screams of despair. Wealthy houses crumbled, temples exploded in flames, markets that hours earlier had been filled with riches and spices were consumed by fire. Gold and silver melted in the streets like wax. The inhabitants ran in all directions trying to escape, but there was nowhere to flee. The entire city was being destroyed, and no one could stop it. The nobles, who once saw themselves as untouchable, screamed in terror. The powerful, who had despised the poor, were now on their knees begging for mercy. The same city that once mocked justice was now being judged by fire itself. There was no escape. The judgment of God had come. But not everyone managed to move forward. Lot's wife, unable to let go of her former life, hesitated. Her attachment to Sodom was still in her heart. The curiosity and longing for what she had left behind were stronger. For a moment she stopped, she turned and looked back. In that instant her body transformed. In seconds she became a pillar of salt. She was not punished simply for looking back. Her heart still belonged to Sodom, and those who belong to sin share the fate of sin. Minutes later, it was all over. The city that was once prosperous was now nothing more than a wasteland of ash and sulfur. The wind carried the stench of destruction. Nothing remained. No buildings, no monuments, no survivors. The rivers dried up. The land was poisoned by sulfur. The city that once prided itself on its greatness vanished completely, as if it had never existed. Now you might be thinking, that happened thousands of years ago. What does it have to do with me? But look around. Aren't we repeating the same mistakes? Sodom was destroyed millennia ago, but what happened in that city seems increasingly similar to the reality we live in today. The city was consumed by fire because it chose the path of immorality, selfishness, and perversion. And when we look at the modern world, we can see that we are following the same path. In Sodom, pleasure was the only rule. People indulged in all their desires without worrying about the consequences, and the most degrading sexual practices were considered normal. Today, we see a society where limitless pleasure, pornography, promiscuity, and betrayal have become part of everyday life. Marriage, a sacred commitment, is often seen as something disposable. Infidelity is celebrated as a form of freedom, and any moral boundary is easily challenged. We are living in an era where the relentless pursuit of physical pleasure has become the main goal in life, and just like in Sodom, the idea that everything is allowed is taking over people's minds. Violence in Sodom was also rampant. There was no respect for life, and the strongest imposed their will on the weakest. The city was full of cruelty, and its inhabitants found entertainment in the suffering of others. Today, cities around the world are filled with violence, and often human life seems to have no value. Injustice spreads like a disease, and the lack of compassion is evident in people's daily actions. But there was another sin that marked Sodom forever: indifference toward those in need. The city was wealthy, gold flowed, markets thrived, and feasts were abundant. But while the nobles indulged in endless celebrations, the poor died of hunger in the streets. And today, we see a world where inequality grows more each day. While some accumulate unimaginable wealth and live in modern palaces, millions die of hunger without access to the basic necessities of life. And you? What do you think about all this? Let us know in the comments. And if today's video taught you something valuable, share it with those who also need to hear this message. Don't forget to leave your like so that this video reaches more people, and subscribe to the channel to continue following our content. Also, watch the videos that will appear now on the final screen. God will surely speak to you through them. That's all for today. May God bless you.